Hey there, so I recently tied the knot with my husband after a 6 year relationship. Our wedding was an intimate affair at his aunt's farmhouse, though I had dreamed of a beach ceremony. We both loved the water and often visited the beach to unwind, so it held special meaning for us. I had even started looking into hotels for our guests, like any other bride, dreaming of a grand celebration. I work in advertising, and despite saving for years to host a luxurious seaside wedding, our plans changed drastically. My parents borrowed a substantial amount of money from me a few months ago. My brother also got married suddenly recently, and although it was a small affair, I was happy for him. Soon after, my mother asked to borrow $115,000 for my father's medical expenses, claiming his sudden illness was due to diabetes complications. I agreed without hesitation, concerned for his health. However, when I visited, my father seemed strangely not very sick, and my mother evaded my questions about his medical reports. She insisted on a specific, expensive, imported drug not covered by insurance. Despite my concerns, she assured me hospitalization wasn't necessary. After a few visits, I realized something was off with my parents, but I held off accusing them outright. Accusing them of lying about a medical emergency would have looked bad if it turned out to be true. I noticed my brother hadn't been visiting them either, and when I asked, my father claimed they didn't want to worry him because he was young and focused on work. Meanwhile, they seemed fine with me being worried sick. I eventually spoke with my brother on the phone after weeks of him not visiting our father. He mentioned he'd visit after his honeymoon. News to me, as I didn't know he had already left. He explained they planned to surprise everyone with stories and photos after a month in Europe. He hadn't told me earlier because he was concerned when I mentioned our father's illness. My brother confirmed our parents had told him they were fine, and maybe they exaggerated the situation to me out of concern. I wanted to believe they hid the truth from my brother to spare his honeymoon, but what I saw at their house left no room for misunderstanding. As my brother revealed more details, warning bells rang loudly in my head. He admitted that our parents were funding his extravagant honeymoon, which would cost them at least $125,000. They were splurging on luxury hotels, fine dining, and shopping, all covered by our parents as a belated wedding gift. It dawned on me that my money was being used to finance this lavish trip, not for any medical emergency. There was never an emergency, no hospital visits, no medical documents. My parents concocted the story solely to divert funds towards my brother's honeymoon. Feeling utterly betrayed, I listened to my brother boast about our parents' generosity, knowing they had taken my wedding savings to finance his extravagant trip. It felt like a stab in the back to realize they prioritized his honeymoon over my wedding plans. When I confronted my parents after that revealing phone call, they explained that they concocted the medical emergency story because they knew I wouldn't willingly fund my brother's honeymoon. They justified their actions by claiming my brother was struggling at work and needed a morale boost. They couldn't afford to finance it themselves without jeopardizing their retirement savings, so they turned to me, believing I had more earning years ahead to recoup the money. They brushed off my anger, insisting it was just money and they would eventually repay me. According to them, my brother's rejuvenation and mental well-being were more important than my wedding plans. This was infuriating because it meant sacrificing my wedding budget for a cause I hadn't agreed to support. I demanded they repay me before my wedding because I needed those funds for my beach wedding expenses. Although my husband's family was helping cover some costs, I still had significant financial responsibilities. My parents had always made it clear they couldn't fund both my education and wedding, and I chose to pay for my wedding myself after college. Now their deception threatened to derail my carefully planned wedding, leaving me feeling betrayed and determined to reclaim what was rightfully mine. When my brother started college, I asked him if our parents had also forced him to choose between education and funding his future wedding. He laughed at the idea, dismissing it as ridiculous. Despite knowing my parents favored him, I never confronted them about it back then. I was young and still dependent on them, trying to avoid worsening our relationship. Years later, during the confrontation about the money they'd borrowed from me, I brought up their favoritism towards my brother. They denied it, but it was obvious to me. I insisted they repay me because I had saved diligently for my dream wedding, not to fund my brother's indulgences. They claimed they couldn't return the money all at once before my wedding and expected me to accept a repayment plan spanning years. According to them, family should come first, citing my willingness to spend on a fabricated medical emergency for my father as a reason to support my brother's mental well-being. The truth was, my brother's work struggles were due to his lack of dedication. His job in sales relied heavily on commissions, and his poor performance led to low earnings. He might have felt disappointed, but he was never at risk of depression from work-related issues. I can assure you that he was never at risk of depression. He simply lacked motivation due to being spoiled by my parents. They exaggerated his job dissatisfaction to justify funding his lavish trip and painting him as a victim in need of rescue. It was all nonsense, and I tried explaining to my parents how important my wedding was. They had committed to certain expenses with my husband's family, which I couldn't cover without the borrowed money. However, my parents insisted they couldn't return the funds before my wedding. They suggested scaling down or asking my husband's family for help. I found myself pleading with them to honor their commitment, but they just shook their heads, refusing to return the money before the wedding. I left their house in tears and confided everything in my husband, who was equally furious and upset. He wanted to involve a lawyer, but I knew there was no written proof of my mother's promise or the intended use of the money. It was all informal, with no binding contracts or documents to support my claim. Since we lacked any written evidence to support our case, filing a lawsuit against my mother seemed futile. We didn't want to waste more money on legal fees with little chance of success. Instead, we shifted our focus to revising our wedding plans. Thankfully, my husband's family stepped in after learning about my parents' actions. His aunt generously offered her farmhouse venue for free. Although we initially desired a beach wedding, his aunt's suggestion piqued our interest, and I decided to visit the venue. The moment I stepped inside, I knew it was perfect. Despite not being by the beach, we felt content with the beautiful farmhouse setting, especially given that we had this venue at no cost. I immersed myself in wedding planning, using it as motivation to distance myself from my parents. I had already decided they wouldn't be invited, but I wavered on inviting my brother since he was unaware of our parents' actions. After my brother returned from his honeymoon, he called me and berated me for asking our parents to return the money. He seemed to think it was no big deal, even though he was the one who spent the money. He promised to repay me eventually, but insisted I should just accept the situation and scale down my wedding plans. His reaction made my decision clear, and I stopped speaking to both him and my parents. Without my entire wedding fund, I couldn't afford a lavish event anymore. Surprisingly, scaling down worked out for the best. Our wedding was beautiful and meaningful, centered around us rather than impressing others with extravagance. We decided to use the money we saved for something more meaningful after the wedding. I'm grateful for how things turned out because our day was still dreamy and special, filled with genuine love from the people who mattered most. When I posted wedding photos recently, I made sure only invited family members knew about the event. I instructed them not to inform my parents or brother to avoid any drama. Now that everything went smoothly, I felt comfortable sharing our joy on social media. They somehow discovered my wedding photos and contacted me the next day, demanding to know why they weren't invited. I found it surprising that they expected an invitation, given our strained relationship. The last time I spoke with any of them ended in tears, and since then, there had been no communication. Despite this, they felt entitled to attend and were upset about being excluded. My parents initiated a call, adding my brother to join in the confrontation. They all yelled at me at once, but I remained unfazed and saw their behavior as entitled. I had already cut them out of my life and didn't want their drama interfering with my newly bliss. I explained that after they borrowed money from me, I had to downsize the wedding guest list to include only family and a few close friends. Since they were neither, they weren't invited. After the call, I blocked them in hopes of ending the drama. However, my husband informed me that my brother had reached out to him, relaying that my parents were deeply hurt and upset. My mother apparently cried so intensely that she nearly fainted. I started feeling guilty, despite knowing they had wronged me. The news of their distress over not being invited made me question my decision, even though I had every right to exclude them after they took money meant for my wedding. It's been a week since my last conversation with my parents and brother, and I decided to cut off all communication with them. My mother's tears won't change the reality. I was the one crying when I pleaded with them to return the money before my wedding, but they brushed it off. Now, I'll treat their actions with the same indifference. You reap what you sow. I explicitly told my brother never to contact me or my husband again, especially not my husband, who is innocent in all of this. I blocked him to ensure my family has no access to me. They've mistreated me for too long, and I won't tolerate it anymore. If I could, I'd file a lawsuit to reclaim my money, although it's a long shot without tangible evidence. My husband believes it's worth pursuing, and we're consulting with a reputable lawyer soon to decide our next steps. In the meantime, I'm brainstorming ways to get them to admit they borrowed the money under false pretenses, claiming it was for a medical emergency. Instead, they gave it to my brother for his honeymoon. Proving this in court will be challenging, but I won't let them off the hook easily. I deserve to get my money back, and I'm determined to make sure they return it to me promptly. Yesterday, I specifically asked my brother not to involve my husband in our family drama, but he ignored that request. When my husband returned from work, he informed me that my parents and brother had bombarded him with texts, demanding he convince me to unblock them. To make matters worse, they showed up at his workplace, tailing him and honking until he pulled over. My husband recognized my brother's car and knew they'd follow him home if he didn't stop. So he decided to face them and hear them out. My brother approached his car and insisted they talk in person. They settled in a nearby diner, where my family proceeded to lecture my husband. My brother expressed disbelief that I cut ties over money, considering it an overreaction. They argued that suggesting we weren't family because of a financial dispute was extreme. They hoped my husband could convince me to see reason and reconcile. My parents claimed they intended to return the money gradually, citing my brother's work struggles and their impending retirement. They painted me as unreasonable and inconsiderate. Instead of confronting them, my husband listened attentively and sympathetically. He suggested they send me a heartfelt message directly rather than through him. Up until now, my family had been accusing me, but my husband managed to convince them that acknowledging their mistakes might appease me. Miraculously, they fell for it. My husband manipulated them into sending a message admitting their actions, believing it would soften my stance and lead to an apology for me. In reality, we view this message as an admission of guilt, a crucial piece of evidence for our legal pursuit against them. I'm genuinely proud of my husband for handling the situation with such finesse. Better than I could have. He's like an evil genius, but he's my evil genius, and I love him for it. My husband's plan worked perfectly, and we're ecstatic right now. My parents and brother foolishly sent me an email confessing to every lie they told and detailing their wrongdoing. Now armed with this proof, our lawyer is moving forward with a petition to reclaim our $115,000. To me, that money represents 5 years of hard work and sacrifice. I refuse to let it go to waste because my brother is lazy and my parents enable him. We're committed to suing them, and we'll stop at nothing to get our money back. We've also started planning our honeymoon, a short trip back to the beach where our story began, a special place for us. In a few months, we might take a longer vacation, but for now, we're focused on doing what makes us happy. I don't want to be like my brother, who posted boastful photos from his honeymoon. Now, he's facing legal action for his actions. It's unfortunate for them, but they brought it upon themselves, and they deserve the consequences. We're ready to face whatever comes our way to